Well, this is an interesting question because there's actually very little in the positive camp, according to most people you talk to in the industry. One needs to look back at why this directive was originally introduced, and it was really a political reaction to the financial crisis, and in many people's views, a misguided attempt to address so-called systemic risk in the private equity industry. Most people within the industry believe that there's no such systemic risk posed by private equity. So that's the starting point, and it's very difficult to find a positive comment from either people like myself or people within the GP or indeed the LP community. That being said, I think the main positive is the so-called passporting rules. So up until now, if you want to offer a fund to European investors, you have to go and inform yourself as to what the individual country-by-country placement rules are. Once you're a fully authorised fund manager, you will be able to passport your funds under a single authorisation. So that actually will be positive if it works according to plan. Pretty much all of the other provisions are seen as being either a benign influence or a negative influence on what private equity managers are trying to do, which is create value for their investors. People like Baker McKenzie and other law firms have done our best to inform our clients and the industry as to what the directive says. So I think awareness is certainly available, if you like, and the directive has been on the statute books in Europe for a couple of years. It's now being implemented. The implementing regulations at the European level have been finalised, and it's now for the individual countries to implement their own rules to bring the directive into effect. So there's no lack of knowledge out there. The problem is that when you get down to the brass tacks, it's actually very difficult to put your finger on what some of the rules mean. So to take an example, the so-called asset stripping rules, which essentially attempt to restrict the what a general partner or manager can do with a portfolio company for the first 2 years of ownership. And the policy objective behind this is to prevent the perceived evil perpetrated by managers in buying companies, sacking the workers, and siphoning off the cash. Now, that was never the case anyway, so it's a solution to a problem that was never there. But the solution is very opaque. So the rules around asset stripping, whilst the principle is fairly simple, the rules are very difficult to understand, and so compliance is a real issue for managers. And that's just one example of many I could give you, and it's essentially asking managers to fight with an arm tied behind the back and a blindfold on. So in those circumstances, I think challenging to comply, and challenging for advisors like Baker McKenzie to actually give clear and unequivocal advice. Well, it's been quite interesting actually, because this is a question that comes up sort of every year at every conference, and it's been debated heavily at SuperInvestor this year. And I think the dynamic, certainly from 2008 right through until probably a year or so ago was very much LP friendly, I should say, investor friendly, excuse me, and really erring towards GPs having to make concessions that they wouldn't have made in the pre-financial crisis years. What we're seeing now is a much more healthy fundraising environment. There's clearly a number of managers who are still struggling to raise funds, but there's some great success stories as well. And the successful funds are heavily oversubscribed, and GPs no longer have to make concessions, the so-called early bird discounts, where you'd give first close investors a discount on their management fee, or you'd make concessions in other areas of the contract with investors, whether that was on the carry structure or the ability for the general partner to claw back distributions, or whatever it may be. Those are no longer necessary for the successful managers. For the managers who are struggling to raise funds, I think the reason they're struggling is not because they're failing to offer those sort of gimmicks, but because the fundamentals of the manager are not sufficient to attract investors. So fund terms, I think they've been relatively steady, but have moved back towards what I would say is a sort of conventional power play, if you like, or balance of power between GPs and LPs. I think the more interesting development is not necessarily on fund terms, but on what LPs want to do with their money. And we're seeing a real shift amongst LPs from sort of purely passive investment into third-party private equity funds to becoming more creative in their investment in alternatives and in the private equity space. So wanting to get more co-investments, wanting to get special deals with GPs completely outside of the context of a fund. So teaming with GPs on club deals, or looking to obtain proprietary information from GPs about deal opportunities, but not by virtue of being a limited partner in a fund, but by virtue of just having that relationship. So I think LPs are tooling up more. They're recruiting talent from the GPs, and with some degree of success, albeit not universal, are playing the GPs at their own game. And I think we're going to see more of that as we get LPs who are developing further as institutions, and, if you like, emulating the teachers and the other big LPs out of Canada, for example, or the GICs of this world, who've been playing this game for a long time. But we're seeing now, if you like, the smaller, less sophisticated LPs moving into becoming more self-sufficient. And I think that's going to be a really interesting trend to watch, and also to see how GPs respond to that.